I think the question of where clinical trials fit into the care of patients with gallbladder cancer is a very important one. I think one very important point about clinical trials, though, is that they're experimental. There are very few situations where you want to pursue an experimental therapy if there is a therapy with established benefit. Because of how clinical trials are set up and because gallbladder cancer is relatively rare, it's quite uncommon to have a clinical trial which is specifically set up for patients with gallbladder cancer. And so when a relevant mutation is found for which there is an agent which is either FDA approved or right now in clinical trials, oftentimes a gallbladder cancer patient would participate in a study which was focused on that mutation and accepted patients with multiple different kinds of cancer. One of the things that patients need to be prepared for if they're going to participate in a clinical trial is that the physician who treats them on the clinical trial may not be their primary oncologist. And oftentimes patients who are being treated by a doctor in their community will end up having to travel to a major academic center to participate in that trial. As a doctor who takes care of patients in that exact situation, I think it's incredibly important to be in contact with that person's primary oncologist and also to have a strong and independent relationship with that patient who will be under my care for the duration of the time that they're on that study, and potentially beyond if there are other things that I can offer them that also might not be available outside of a clinical trial. Even if a patient appears to meet all of the criteria to be eligible in a study, there may still be additional factors that a doctor doesn't know about a patient that could preclude them from entering. So the example that I used before and comes up quite often is if a patient has been exposed to viral hepatitis, not something that everybody knows, but something that has to be tested before they go onto a clinical trial, and sometimes it means that they can't participate. So even if someone feels completely healthy except for their cancer and seems to have everything working appropriately, it's still possible that during the screening period, it will be discovered that that patient is not eligible. Because conventional chemotherapy or standard of care chemotherapy is very reasonable and appropriate as a first treatment, that oftentimes gives patients the breathing room to start to learn about what their other options are. And even for patients who are being treated at academic centers who have many clinical trials open, typically they're not on a clinical trial as their first treatment. And so for patients who have been diagnosed with gallbladder cancer and are playing catch-up, trying to figure out the whole situation, there's often an opportunity while they're on treatment, on that first treatment, to plan ahead and think about what might be better down the road. And that's a very good opportunity to make a trip to an academic center for a second opinion or to learn about what's happening. And so there's no question that there are studies which obligate that the patient have not received chemotherapy or any other systemic therapy before. These are relatively uncommon for patients with gallbladder cancer. These are more common, for example, for breast cancer or for liver cancer, where some of these specific rules are quite relevant. There are studies that do have that character, but they're relatively rare. The way that clinical trials are paid for is actually a very important thing for patients to understand. It's also a little complicated. So when a clinical trial is run, it is typically a combination of experimental things and standard of care things. And probably the clearest example of this is blood work that's done to monitor for safety, or a CT scan that might be done to see if the cancer is responding or growing. Those are all considered to be standard of care procedures. And so if you're a patient on a clinical trial, a CT scan or the vast majority of the blood work that you receive, although not all of it, would be billed to your insurance. And so whatever the terms of your insurance are, those scans and labs will be subject to those. That becomes a complexity because some patients don't have authorization to be treated at particular hospitals or by particular medical groups. And so one of the things which is important for me as a doctor when a patient wants to come onto the study is to confirm that they have authorization to be treated for the standard of care elements of their study at my hospital, and if not, to obtain an authorization from their insurance so that they can. In terms of the other components of the study, anything that is experimental would be paid for in the course of the study. And so typically when we think about clinical trials, particularly treatment-oriented clinical trials, the thing that we think about most is what is the experimental treatment. And so the experimental treatment is paid for, I think in essentially every case, by either the company that is studying the treatment or by a grant to the institution which is performing the clinical trial. I think it's really hard to find good information about clinical trials, and particularly in the case of gallbladder cancer, because most of the trials are not directed at gallbladder cancer. If you do a Google search for gallbladder cancer and clinical trial, it's not going to get you what you need most likely. Some of the places where I've seen patients get useful information is from their doctors, of course, from a second opinion in particular. If they make a trip to an academic center, that's a place where they'll have an opportunity to learn much more about their options. And also there are certain patient advocacy groups which actually do try to build awareness, and I've been very impressed by the work that they do, and I think that that's a good place to find some information. And other patients, connecting with other patients with your diagnosis is something that is not right for everyone, but can be a really valuable source of information.